This paper has been developed out of things I noticed when I was researching one of the creative elements for my PhD, a series of poems set in the British Antarctic bases in the 1950s and the 60s, initially inspired by my father's time there. It was partly knowledge of my father, and partly that I was thinking about creating a sense of Antarctic place on the page, never having been there, which made me attentive to the power of food, not just as a substance keeping a person alive, but to evoke, in the whiteness of both snow and page, a sensory and emotional response to distant places and times. With reference primarily to some of the base diaries and reports from Halley and Lockroy in the early years of the British Antarctic bases, I'm going to look at the psychological, physical and symbolic significance of food in both its material and imagined forms, and consider the role it played in maintaining individual morale, developing team spirit, and creating a sense of home. The requirements of food for survival is self-evident, and the tragedy of the death of the Polar Party, so close to the depot which could have provided the supplies they needed for the last push back to base, is etched in British cultural history. However, less familiar perhaps is Apsley Cherry Garrard's speculation that part of the problem for the polar team lay in the proportions of fat, protein and carbohydrate which were inadequate in maintaining the energy required to heat their bodies and thaw out their clothes and sleeping bags, over and above the work of man-hauling. The substance of supplies on the early British bases and the management of rations demonstrates their proximity to the earlier heroic age expeditions. Excess food was transported south so that there were substantial margins of error, and emergency food stores were buried even close to base. When the 1948 Lockroy team moved in, they found food left over from earlier years, creating through this chain of supply and consumption a sense of a connected society, even though its members were scattered, furthered in the detailed lists and advice left for the relief parties taking over. The need for careful calculation of appropriate rations for each man according to the nature of the work, and for that to be tried and tested, can be seen in some of the early reports. Food reports for the bases included feedback on the rations used on sledging trips, noting varying ratios of fat, carbohydrate and protein, and the impact on the men, and they adapted their measures according to their observations. The language of the reports and diaries unsurprisingly reflects this kind of calculation, and writing which it wants to convey a sense of this world needs to engage with this kind of language. There's a list of food at the centre of Bill Manhire's poem The Hut, and in the ice house, Anne Michaels summons the essence of the time and place to which Scott was travelling by quoting a list of supplies, numbers, weights, food, fuel, accommodation, and the means of transport. There's a rhythm to it, the pulse of survival. The necessity of food was not just about the survival of the body, however. It provided a significant psychological boost. The importance of food on a static base was elaborated in the psychological report written at Halley in 1959. Food is an important psychological as well as purely physical consideration, it's stated. It is supplied in abundant quantities, but it is much too stereotyped in a life already fraught with similarity and monotony. Appetites fall off in bad conditions and are at their lowest ebb in winter. At these times they need much encouragement by variety and artistic presentation. If the supplies to create a more varied diet were not available, special occasions could provide for variety. The table could be dressed for birthdays, days of national celebration, Midwinter's Day. Because the archives are still closed, I was unable to access some of the Midwinter's menus which are stored there. This one my father saved from Scott Base in 1964 illustrates some of the ways in which the midwinter feast helped counteract the darkness of the days. The sketch on the front is a reminder of heroic age expeditions and endurance. The inside left page draws the team together with affectionate cartoon representations. The back page shows the base as serene, its roof lit silver despite the midwinter dark. The menu itself doesn't appear to illustrate any of the monotony of the diet commented on earlier, but this was an occasion for which people saved special items, and even if the range of regular food was not enough, the Royal Society had provided a hamper and the Scott Polar a box of goodies. Midwinter was an excuse to hoist the flags, to don their ordinary clothes and chat over the radio with the lads on other bases. It was a change, a celebration, a morale booster, a reaffirmation of contact. It was also a way of remembering and feeling at home. In 1956, the men at Halley began the day with hen's eggs which had been kept all the way from home, and the table was laid in a manner as close as possible approximating an English middle-class dinner party, with paper hats reminding of Christmas celebrations. At other times, the food itself was a way of recalling a distant place. My father's sense of home down the access hatch and through the front door of Halley had much to do with the smell and taste of food. In his book about his Antarctic experiences, he wrote about the way the taste of coffee brought back memories of home, but the proximity of the alien environment is evident too in the strange taste and orange colour of the sponge cake made from penguins' eggs. There are references in the diaries to stuffed roast seal's heart and excellent penguin steaks, the indigenous residents of the continent cooked in the European manner. As Antarctic life moved further away from the extremities of the heroic expeditions, the provision of fresh meat was occasionally the source of conflict. This remark in the entry of 30th of July in the 1956 Halley diary seems pertinent. Gus has mended some teacups and our only china pudding basin with araldite. It seems to work very well, which is a good thing, otherwise we would only have about half the number of cups we require. This careful mending of crockery provides an unintentional but effective symbol for the difficulties associated with preserving a sense of home in an often hostile environment. The wider social and political influences behind the establishment of British bases is represented by the gifts from the Royal Society and the Scott Polar Institute for the Midwinter's Day meal, by the raised flags, the toast to the Queen on her birthday, rum with tea on Trafalgar Day, and round the Empire programme on Christmas Day. Governmental and military institutions are evidenced in the foodstuffs taken south, military pickles and House of Parliament HP sauce, and gifts such as Harvey's Bristol cream are reminders of commercial backing. It would be possible to quote food and approaches towards it in support of post-colonial arguments highlighting the intentional colonisation of Antarctic white space. However, the Halley diary talks of a pig from South Georgia and the beef and sheep from Rio, showing that however much this meat might be cooked in the British style, an element of international provisioning was necessary. The informal diary from Deception in 1962 talks of the small fee of grapefruit juice and wine paid by the Argentinians in lieu of fishing rights in Whalers Bay, and there was frequent social contact and exchange of gifts between the British, Argentinians and Chileans, despite political tensions created by overlapping claims. Shared meals and celebrations resist the divisiveness of distant geopolitical manoeuvring. Cooking was also a means of stepping outside expected gender boundaries, to fill the base hut with the smell of baking and home in a way which would have been expected of the woman of the house. The naming of the repurposed tractor crate at Halley, in which the men had their tea and meals, as Ma Watson's, is telling. In the Bass oral histories, cooking is mentioned as one of the major learning experiences of the Antarctic. Adapting to the combined demands of domestic labour and scientific work was not always easy. The work was time-consuming and tedious, as this ode found in one of the Deception journals shows. They came to be explorers, well that's what people think. Instead they're washing dishes, piled 3 foot high on a sink. The psychological report from Halley mentions the way in which some people wanted to be treated according to their position or rank at home, but as they adapted to Antarctic life, team spirit manifested itself in helping one another out. For example, the person filling the Sonde balloon ready for flight filled the domestic water tanks on the return journey. The entanglement of humans, animals and the environment is evident in writing about animals used for food, man food or dog food. Birds provided both companionship and fresh meat, a way of reading the environment and a source of data. The importance of companionship is testified by this picture of Eric Back and the Port Lockroy pig, which never was slaughtered and eaten. Apparently, Back kept a photograph of this pig on his desk for years. The human intruder in the Antarctic environment is both dominant and dependent, and there's a kind of equality with the creaturely world in this. Everything needs to eat. A meal is more than the sum of its parts, wrote Sarah Wheeler in her account of her travels on the Antarctic continent. and at the end of the text there's a recipe for bread and butter pudding, Antarctic version. It ends with the line, "Get on the radio and call everyone in." Food is not just about fuel for the animal self. Even as something imagined, it can generate a positive psychology, and its preparation and consumption can create and maintain a shared sense of values, belonging, and identity. Thank you for listening.